So hello and welcome to Physician Spotlight, which is a forum to learn more about outstanding senior leaders, young rising stars, and international colleagues in the field of nutrition to discuss really important topics and ideas. And with the help of Aspen, we are bringing these videos to you today. So I'm your host, Dr. Lindsay Russell, and our guest today is Dr. John Alverdy. Dr. Alverdy is the Executive Vice Chair, Department of Surgery at U Chicago in Medicine, and is well known for complex minimally invasive gastrointestinal surgical procedures, and he's been a superstar in his field. He's an avid clinician scientist with numerous accolades before in the past, and most notably, he's the winner of the 2023 George Blackburn Award for Mentorship at Aspen. And his work really includes connecting the human microbiome and post-surgical leaks and infections. And I'm so happy and excited to have Dr. Alverdy today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Russell. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be the George Blackburn mentor. He is a great man and has done so much for our field. I'm truly honored.
Yeah, and that's I'm honored as well as speaking with you and to really speak about that highlight in your career. And I guess the first question I always like to start with is, your journey in relating nutrition into your practice as a surgeon. Can you comment on about how you found your interest in nutrition and how that's influenced your career?
Sure. I spent my research time at the University of California, San Francisco with Dr. George Sheldon, who was a surgeon, scientist, and a pioneer in nutrition. He ran the nutritional support service at San Francisco General Hospital. So, we would address issues of nutrition. We had a fully functioning laboratory where we fed TPN to rats long-term over a 2-week period. We would round on all the patients and discuss them. And so it became very clear to me that, without nutritional support, most of those patients, after they had undergone, significant trauma, they wouldn't be alive without nutritional support afterward, be it enteral or parenteral. So it became a focus of mine, and I began to study how gut bacteria would be able to thrive in such an environment.
I think that's truly wonderful. And I think thank you for sharing your experience. And, that touches on, the role of mentorship in your career. And I can imagine working with such a leader in clinician scientist and nutrition, how has that influenced your guide to see the light of nutrition and therapy? How has really mentorship helped you along the way, or even becoming a mentor yourself at this stage of your career?
Yeah, I think it's very important, but I just remember those figures, Dr. Doug Wilmore, obviously Dr. George Blackburn, figures such as Dr. George Sheldon, and of course the father of TPN. These figures were inspirational figures. Not only were they operative surgeons and clinicians, but they also, inspired us to study nutrition as a key measure to be able to take care of patients. In other words, it's one thing to think about closing a hole in the aorta or patching something up. It's another thing to think about how you're going to feed this person whose gastrointestinal tract is sort of on hold for the moment till they heal. And that really became the challenge, when Dr. Stan Dudrick, fed that beagle and presented that work, we're all just stunned that intravenous nutrition would be available to our patients. So, I was fortunate enough to train in the 80s and practice in the early 90s to see that sort of change in many ways. And then there were nutrients that came in and came out, that's still happening. First it was glutamine, then it was short chain fatty acids. Yes, no, and it continues. But, basically what's striking is you need to feed and nourish. And if you can do that while you're taking care of the patient, you can keep them alive and get them to recover.
Yeah, no, that's certainly great to hear. And I hope you appreciate that, as a young professional as well. I certainly find you very inspiring, especially in the field of, being a clinician scientist. I think as you mentioned, training in a time where you had these giants and inspirational, how do you approach, continuing that legacy of a true clinician scientist, or how do you inspire the younger generation to kind of get involved, or the challenges they may face to become a true clinician scientist?
Yeah, I think for me, it often all comes down to time and money. You have to design your career or your job so that you have time to actually write grants. And then you have to be creative enough to be able to obtain them and keep them, refunded through the course of time, so that you have the money and the time to do this. And then, you have to ask important questions. I mean, it's you can't ask. Somebody said to me once, the best science is that which is the methods are elegant and the results are unobvious. So you have to ask questions that really are compelling in the field. You can't just say, for example, older, sicker patients do worse than younger, healthy people with less sort of end stage disease. That's too obvious. And it's very descriptive. You have to dig deep into the weeds, and often it's the molecular weeds.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, that brings up another thing that comes to mind. We speak about nutrition being so multidisciplinary in the clinical sense. We have surgeons, nutrition clinicians, general surgery, you name it, PT, OT. Do you find the same thing in the field of the research as well? When you look at things like metabolomics and other microbiome work, can you touch on your experience with kind of multidisciplinary teams in that sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I worked at a time where, I was doing my own ELISA assays, literally pipetting into a multi-well plate, to a time now where we can measure anything and we outsource most of our measurements. So when we do metabolomics, we get samples, either plasma or fluids, and they get sent to the metabolomics facility. And then you'll get terabytes of data that you have to harness, put into graphical form so you can actually interpret them. And the same is with any samples where you do proteomics, for example, in the blood or in fluids, or if you do sequencing, genetic sequencing, either for host genes or for microbial genes, if you're studying the microbiome. And if you can't hand off those samples, get them properly analyzed with all the right internal controls, and then work with somebody and be fully intellectually engaged with them, you can't actually ask important questions. And I see a lot of studies, or I review a lot of studies where, I see clinicians saying, I have these two disparate groups of patients. I'm just going to hand you samples. Now, analyze them, put them into graphic form, and write me a paper. And that doesn't work. And so now, even more important than before, is asking the right question. Because you can measure anything now. Before it was like, I have an assay for IL-6, so nobody can measure IL-6 but me. And then, 100 papers come out looking at IL-6 in 100 different clinical scenarios. And it's okay. But now anybody can measure anything. And so now it's all about the question. And there's still a lot of important questions left for gastroenterologists, for nutritionists, for physical therapists, like you said, for pharmacists, and for surgeons.
I think that's really great and really kind of profound too. I think it's important to get back to the basics of what is the question and interpret. So I guess my final question is, do you have any really words of wisdom for early career healthcare professionals or researchers in the field of nutrition. I know, you're winning this, mentorship award, and I think if you could have a little tidbit for our audience members today would be great.
Sure. That's a great question. And it's very hard to know because, I always say that, at least the advice I give to people is when you're looking for your first job and nobody tells you how to look for your first job. It's like you go to college, then you go to medical school, then you go this long training and subspecialty training, and you just kind of want to finish and, live your life. And at the same time, there's family issues, partners, spouses, then there's financial issues. And you take a job that maybe has a location that is mutually beneficial to you and your family or your spouse or your kids or whatever, and it meets your career goals, but it doesn't necessarily, right, meet your research goals. And, can you have it all? Say, I want to work in Chicago at a university place. I want protected time for research. By the way, I want a clinician's salary, and, I got to pay off my school debt. And they're like, good luck with that. So I always say, that first job, what we call the CLO, the contingency letter of offer, it's not easy. I even have to advise my daughter on this is how do you have the inner directedness and the confidence to say, this is what I want to make. This is how much time I want protected. This is where I want to work. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that, and still be attractive for the job. And so, so what's my advice? If you're really committed to becoming a clinician scientist, it doesn't matter what your specialty is, GI, internal medicine and nutrition, or surgery. You need to put yourself in a place where you can actually pull it off. That's the single most important thing, at least to me. Can you get a job that will let you do the things you want to do? And then you've got to write grants and get the money and create the workforce to do it, because you can't take care of patients and then run into the lab and start pipetting or go to your computer and start doing it's too much. You need help, just as you mentioned to me. You need help analyzing the samples. You need help interpreting the samples. You need, if you're a basic scientist like me, you need students and residents at the bench operating on the mice, sacrificing the mice, sending the samples, and then you have to have lab meeting. And it's a lot these days because, I'm saying you, because you're the younger generation, you train longer and in much more difficult circumstances, I think, than we do. You're older, you're in greater debt, and the job market's not the same. So I think there are more challenges that we have to start thinking about. But one thing I always look at is there was a lot of research that was sort of superfluous to clinical practice. That was more, it was produced and generated as a career building event more than it was to apply to patients. And I think your generation and the younger generations want to do work that has a clinical impact. And that's a good thing. I totally understand where you're getting at, and I think it's very helpful advice, especially what you've seen with the changing practices of clinical practice demands and laboratory work as well. So I think that's very, very valuable. Thank you so much. No worries.
I really appreciate you taking the time to joining us today, and really thank Aspen for their partnership to continue with this program, and our audience for taking time to listen today. And I really hope everyone has a great day.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Russell.
Thank you.